I've now closed my body wall layer, and I'm ready to move on to my subcutaneous layer, which is in this model depicted as a foam. In this model, there's a layer of mesh in between the foam layer, sort of in the center of it, and that allows me to have it hold stitches a bit better. So the foam may tear a little bit as I'm doing my subcutaneous sutures, and that's okay, but I'm going to make sure that I incorporate that mesh layer so that my sutures don't tear out. I'm going to choose to start its continuous pattern, a simple continuous with buried knots to do the subcutaneous layer. And so I do need to suture from my dominant hand to my non-dominant. For most of you, that's right to left, and that's what I'll be doing today. Typically, we grasp the area, the tissue that we're going to suture. Right now, I'm peeling the skin back from the sub-Q, which is something you wouldn't really want to do in your live patient because it can create more tissue trauma. So you would reach in and grasp your sub-Q, but in this case I'm going to do this so that you can see a little bit better. About 5 millimeters down from the end of my incision, I'm going to point my needle towards myself, and so you'll see this is forehanding the needle. Backhanding would be if I pointed the tip away from me. So as I'm placing this, I'm going to go from deep to superficial, all within the sub-Q layer. So deep in the sub-Q to superficial in the sub-Q. And then I'm going to pull through most of my suture, and I'm going to take the tail end and I'm going to point it towards the head of the patient. When I go ahead and do the other side, I'm going to come, roughly speaking, straight across and go from superficial to deep, all within that sub-Q layer, making sure to catch the mesh layer and retrieving my needle. Then I'm going to gather my suture up because at the beginning of the line it's fairly long suture. And then what I have here is if I come down the incision, I have first a superficial cross piece and then my two ends which are facing towards the head of my patient. That means I'm ready to go ahead and tie these so that they can bury. Square throws should suffice for here since it's a monofilament suture and there's no tension. But you'll see that instead of pulling straight across like I would for my body wall sutures, I'm choosing instead to pull along the length of the incision. The reason I'm choosing to do that is because it helps my knot to bury. It does not improve my knot security though, so I'm not going to do that with my body wall layer, which is really key for keeping my patient together. So once I've done 4 throws, then I'm going to cut the suture end at 2 to 3 millimeters, and I'm going to get ready to do the rest of my line. So my knot is buried at this point, but I need to make sure it stays buried, and the way that I need to do that is by taking one last little half bite on my side from deep to superficial. And what this does is it pulls the knot deep because the first part of that bite was deep. So now all the rest of my sutures are going to be placed from superficial to deep and deep to superficial on my far and near side. So this little half bite, it doesn't pull the skin or the sub-Q in this case together. So my next stitch I'm going to take fairly close to it. And so on this one I'm going to take that superficial to deep. And then you can either come up in the center like you did for the others, or you can come all the way across if your needle's large enough. Deep to superficial on my near side. So what I'm doing now is kind of going along like a spiral notebook down the length of the patient. When I get all the way to the other end is when I'm going to do my buried knot for the other end. If I place my needle incorrectly and it's coming up through the skin or it's not coming from where I want it to be, then I will back the needle up and replace it. Once I've pulled the needle all the way through the tissue, I no longer have the ability to pull it out or to put it back through and to adjust where it comes out. So I need to make sure that I adjust those things before I pull the needle out. With this sub-Q, we want gentle apposition, so edge for edge. I don't want to be seeing red body wall in between the two because that creates some dead space where fluid can pool. And I don't want fluid to pool in that area. And so by closing sub-Q, I'm obliterating that dead space and making it so that it's not going to pool fluid there. I do have to pull this suture line snug as I go along. If I wait all the way until the end, it's going to be very difficult for me to tighten it from beginning to end. So I'm kind of keeping track of that as I go along. I'm going to take one more regular bite, and then I'm going to switch over to burying my knot. So in this pattern, you can tie the entire pattern with your needle facing towards you, in other words, forehand. That's what I'm demonstrating. Some surgeons will backhand part of the knots, so you may see that as a variation in practices, but the forehand technique is a little bit easier to place, in my opinion. I'm going to grasp on the far side a bit of my sub-Q and go again from superficial to deep. I'm going to draw my needle all the way up in the center so that this loop goes away. I want a deep loop to tie to, and this is not a deep loop. It's superficial loop, so I want it to go away as soon as it can so that I don't get confused by it later. And then I'm going to come on my near side, and I'm going to go from deep to superficial on my near side. And that's exactly the stitch that I had been doing all the way down here. The only difference is that I'm keeping this deep loop up. So that loop from the center I'm keeping up. And then that loop is deep, but now the needle end is still superficial. So I have one more bite to make. I'm going to go on the far side again and go superficial to deep through my sub-Q layer and draw it up in the area next to the loop. I'm going to pull this throw down and show you a trick, hopefully, that some people use. So as you pull this throw down, hold on. So this is and this is what happens sometimes, you get your loops all mixed up. And so when you do that, make sure you locate the deep loop, which I have identified here, and the deep end, and make sure that they're next to each other. And then farther down the incision will be that last superficial cross piece, and then the incision ends. So this is how I know I'm going to get a knot that buries. When I bury this knot, just like with the first knot, I'm going to choose to pull cranial and caudal with my patient. Because I'm tying to a loop, I need to be very careful to get square throws. So I'm going to open my needle drivers to try to equalize the sides of that knot because of the loop. So each time cranial caudal needle drivers open at the very end. And with loops, 4 to 6 throws are typically tied. Because this is not a holding layer and I'm only closing it for dead space issues, and because I am trying to bury this knot, I'm going to choose to tie 4 and then go ahead and cut.